Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for listening today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. We explore a lot of different topics on this show, but most of them revolve around the same core question. How can we change in useful ways and get more out of our lives along the way? Now, change is hard, and most of us have gone through a time in life when it felt like we were just running in place. We were unable to make the progress that we wanted to. It probably wasn't for lack of trying. You read the books, you followed the exercises, maybe you even saw a therapist. But sometimes it seems like no matter what you do, you find yourself back at square one. You're stuck. Today, we're focusing on why this happens, the key factors that stop us from changing in the ways we want to. So, to help me do that, I'm joined as usual by clinical psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson, and we're going to draw on his roughly 50 ish years of working with people to help us answer this. So, Dad, how are you doing today?
What a long, strange trip it's been.
Yeah.
I'm doing well, and I love this topic. It's been one of the top 3 honors of my life, probably, to be able to work with all the people I've worked with over the years, and they put up with me, and I learned a lot from them, and I'm looking forward to sharing that today.
So I've got 7-ish of these that I just kind of wrote out on a sheet as I was thinking about this topic. I'm sure you'll add a few more. Maybe we'll get up to a convenient round number like 10. If we don't, hey, the algorithm gods will have to smile on us anyways. And I wanted to start this episode with what I think is like an important disclaimer for everything we're going to talk about today. Some people have significant factors in their life that just limit the amount of change that they have access to. This could include some kind of a major underlying health condition, a mental health condition, lack of resources, all of that. Those things are a huge piece of the puzzle here. And everything is going to be relative to your individual context. And the bottom line is that big challenges are generally harder to change than smaller challenges. So, because it's what we do on this podcast, we are mostly going to be focusing on what I'll call psychological factors. That's the stuff that we can do something about either in our mind or in our lives. For starters, it is more fun for us to focus on those things. And it's also just where we have the greatest agency. So I just wanted to start by saying that to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about today.
That's a great foundation. Um, my own experience with people is that the good news is that uh, with certain things that we're going to be talking about, people really can change for the better, including with regard to extremely serious underlying psychological factors and issues. And sometimes, though, you just can't change. The best you can do is to be able to kind of be with what's there. For example, if there's organic damage to the brain, dementia, delirium, direct injury, that's a really serious thing. Second, sometimes people are just flooded with physical pain. They can barely move without screaming in agony, or they're flooded with emotional pain. They're in complete shock. So I want to just call that out, and also obviously call out, as was implicit in what you said, that in the biopsychosocial framework here, the social extends into systemic forces that can continually bang on a person and keep shoving them back under the waterline, even after they, with great effort, heroic effort, crawl out. So I'm really glad you framed it that way. And then inside that frame, we're going to talk about everything you can do
Yeah.
with claiming the power that you do have, tending to the causes that you can nurture for your own sake and that of others.
All right. So, Dad, as a longtime clinical psychologist, you've worked with a lot of people, as we've already alluded to. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, what did you see over and over again that tended to get in the way of people improving, rectifying whatever issues they were dealing with, or kind of anything else you would like to point out here at the beginning?
This topic, Forrest, has been really good for me personally to reflect on. And I'll probably gain some personal value from it that I'll be applying to some of my own issues. I would think first, as a framework, I think of the continuum roughly running from healing to growing to awakening. And so, what I'm going to talk about is about that whole continuum, although we will focus on the healing aspect of that continuum. Second point, uh, It's also useful for me to think about this in a way that does not make a categorical distinction between the outer world and the inner world. In terms of their deep nature, actually, thoughts and things have the same nature, even if one is intangible and the other is tangible. Um, they're all made of parts that are connected and changing. So it's dynamic, fluid, interdependent processes. In that context, the same sorts of approaches that work in the outer world also work in the inner world. For example, cooking. So, what are the three things that work when you're making a batch of cookies or you're doing anything in the outer world? First of all, you need to find out and know what is true, the facts, discernment, clear seeing, investigation, respect for reality as it is. Okay. Second, you need to acquire various skills, competencies, capabilities. And then third, you need to make efforts. So I observe what is true about whether I have all the ingredients I need. I have some basic skills about how I assemble them together, and I make the effort to actually do that.
You know, Dad, I didn't see the cookie theory of personal growth coming through on this podcast episode, but I'm glad that we're here, and I totally agree with like the content of what you're saying here.
That's right. Okay, good. You're exactly right. We'll just call it knowing, skillfulness, effort. Now, the same thing is true in the inner world. And what's remarkable to me routinely is people get that these three aspects are really useful in the outer world, but they don't apply them to the inner world. It's almost as if the inner world is somehow categorically different, but it's not. So in the inner world, there too, what is really useful is gradually knowing what is true. And that knowing tends to be particularly emotional and somatic and intimate, as well as having some insight. And then second, there are skills and qualities that kind of alongside. I think of qualities as more like stable factors, like the degree to which a person is open-minded or has positive mood or has a general attitude of agency and self-efficacy. And then there's skills in knowing how to actually work with your thoughts and feelings, such as the key skill that I've focused on a lot, as you know, of deliberate internalization of whatever's good. And then third, making efforts there. Got to make efforts there. So when I think about people progressing or not progressing in therapy or in more informal settings with more of a focus on probably growing and sometimes even awakening, I look to these areas immediately. What are factors that promote knowing what is true, being skillful, developing skills and using them, and then third, effort? What promotes it and what inhibits it? So we have promoters and inhibitors. And we can kind of think in that way. And then it becomes very straightforward much of the time for me. Kind of like, oh, okay, what's going on in each of these three aspects? Knowing, skillfulness, effort. What's promoting that I can encourage more of? What's inhibiting that we can, work on to remove? And then we keep going forward.
So the first thing that I thought of when we began kind of brainstorming this exercise together lands in that first category of knowing, I think, although
Okay.
you might finesse that a little bit. And that's actually self-acceptance. One of my favorite quotes is from Carl Rogers. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change.
Beautiful.
And I think that's really interesting, right? Because a huge factor here for people when they're going on this adventure of trying to get a little bit better, or trying to deal with whatever issue they're trying to deal with, is how we define what getting better looks like for a person. All of this suffering in our lives comes from trying to change these immutable aspects of ourselves. And I think that acceptance in general, we can think of as just like the practice of seeing things clearly. Like you were saying, right? Like what's true here?
Yeah.
What's true about us? What are we accepting about the way we are right now? And what's true out in the world? Like what's true about our lives right now? And I think that you just really have to start with what's true.
That's beautifully said. And of course, recognizing what's true is different from our values or preferences
Yeah,
related to it.
totally. Yeah.
I can accept that, let's say, I felt scared and lonely as a kid while wishing that I hadn't. All right. And still it's also unchangeable. That's actually how it was for me when I was a kid for various reasons. I would say, with regard to acceptance, when people are caught up in being at war with themselves or being internally divided, those definitely obstruct the healing and growing and awakening process. It just gets in the way. And there's a particular kind of acceptance I want to flag here that's become really focused upon in sometimes called third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, or new wave therapies, mindfulness-based therapies, in which it's a incredibly important. It's a very, very much of a promoting factor, promoting the good, to be able to decouple from what you're experiencing. People call that different names: decenter. Steve Hayes, brilliant genius, really, of psychotherapy, calls it defusion. You're no longer fused with your thought. You can step back and think about your thought, for example, and you don't need to believe it. So that capacity to be able to disidentify from what we're experiencing and get some breathing room from it, some buffering around it, is definitely a very strong promoting factor. And when it's not present, that's very, very much of an obstruction.
So we've done, I think, probably 3 or 4 episodes on various forms of self-acceptance in the past here, Dad. It's a major
Yeah.
topic for us. We talk about it regularly. But pretty quickly here, I'm wondering, let's say that you're working on a topic with a person, either in therapy formally or just kind of generally, you're talking about it with them as a friend. You're able to identify, you think pretty accurately, that this is a significant issue for somebody. And they're just kind of having a hard time coming around to the seeing clearly part of it. Are there things that you might do with them to help them with that process?
Yeah, I can think of 3 hacks, we might call it, off the top. The first is to recognize, and that's the seeing clearly, and then disidentify from, that would be skillfulness and making an effort, from the inner voices that are not accepting. Typically, the inner perspectives, the views, the voices that are critical, shaming, that come at you with these tirades of shoulds, ugh, and being able to separate from them. Like, for example, a trick is to give them each a little funny personality that enables you to dismiss them a little more. You can kind of see them as a person ranting away at a new, with a party hat on. They look ridiculous. And so it gives you some breathing room from them. So that would be one thing. Second hack is to know what it is to actually accept something in a simple way. So start simple. Like, you have a glass of water. I accept that this is made of glass. I accept that it's half full, right? I accept that. And then you can kind of play with broadening it out, like, oh, I accept that my mouth is a little thirsty right now. Oh, okay. I accept that my throat's a little dry. Okay. You know, and so you know what it feels like to actually accept something. And then third, you can apply this to yourself. And there are different versions of this. One of the more powerful ones, warning here, is to stand in front of a mirror and go through your body and say specifically, I accept that this part of my body, I accept my ears, I accept that my ears look like that. And you can move through the rest of your body, because for a lot of people, self acceptance relates to feeling bad about or even ashamed of their own body, for example. Or you could write a little note to yourself: Dear Forrest, you might do it. Dear Forrest, I accept that you are da 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 da. Dear Rick, I accept that you are sometimes irritable. Dear Rick, I accept that you can work too hard. Dear Rick, you know, I accept that you have a goofy imagination. You just practice that. Okay, good. So those 3 things.
I think that's a great quick summary of what we could spend at least several hours, if
Yeah.
not several days, talking about. But it's a really good place to start for people, because that acceptance content, I think, is such a crux around so much of this, including how it relates to those things that we we really can't change about the condition of our lives. And accepting those things can often help us identify the things that we really can change and then apply effort to them in that way.
Yeah. Can I add a fourth? I'm just thinking of it. In
Yeah, go ahead.
important relationships, it can be very powerful to have a intimate conversation with your friend, your partner, your relative, and really essentially explore, even as a request from you to them, do you accept me? Do you accept really all of who I am? Doesn't mean that you're waiving your rights. It doesn't mean that you might not have preferences. I welcome your advice and help, my friend, over time. I'm perfect as I am, and I could use some improvement, etc. Like Suzuki Roshi said. That's very poignant.
To move along to what I think is the second major point that came up to me is all of the material that we've explored related to attachment. And this
Uh-huh.
gets maybe a little pedantic here, but definitionally, attachment is what keeps us stuck, right? Most of the time, change of any kind requires detaching from one thing in order to
Truth.
attach to another,
Yeah.
right? And this is one of those small but I think very important insights. If we look at our behavior, right? Time's a zero sum game. We can't add one kind of thing without taking a different kind of thing away because the number of hours that we have in a day are limited. Our behavior is kind of similar that way. If we're choosing one behavior, we're not choosing a different behavior. And if we're choosing that behavior, well, then we're no longer choosing that other behavior, right? So to get good at change is to get good at the game of attachment, to get skillful at disidentifying from the behaviors or the people, the places, the things, whatever it is for you, that are causing us more problems and to get better at attaching to the places that we want to go, right? And a huge aspect of this gets to identity and attachment to self, because the way that we establish our identity in many ways kind of builds the bars of the cage that's around us, establishes the space that we're allowed to play in as a person because we have a particular kind of self concept. So if there's a way that you want to change or improve that is opposed by a self identity that you have or a form of self concept that exists inside of you, it's going to be really hard to change in that way. And a lot of this self concept for people is actually subconscious in nature. We don't really have it at the top of our awareness because not a lot of people go through a process of identifying, like, oh, here are my various forms of self concept that are floating around my brain. Like, that's just not a very common thing that we do, even though it is a very useful exercise here for people. So for starters, Dad, what do you think about that?
Classic line from Ajahn Chah, great Thai teacher in the Vipassana Buddhist tradition. If you let go a little, you'll have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you'll be completely peaceful. So if I were to think about that dimension, I think about rigidity, another different aspects of problematic attachment, rigidity.
Sure. I love that you're highlighting this. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Um, Also, if you think of the 5 factors of personality structure with the acronym OCEAN, you know it obviously. First one, O for openness. So low openness, people who are very low to that. Another aspect, I think of Piaget's models of learning, assimilation or accommodation. Assimilation, you suck information into familiar structures, even if it actually contradicts it. Accommodation, you're willing to actually change your frames of reference. You're not so attached to your frames of reference. You're willing to update your priors. And then you deal with temperament because, frankly, some people are just temperamentally more toward the OCD end of the spectrum. OCD, in effect, is a loss of autonomy. You're talking about increasing autonomy, or what Steve Hayes, to name check him again here, he talks about flexibility, psychological flexibility, right, as major factors here. So, what's a way to help people with this, maybe who tend toward rigidity, closed mindedness, um, kind of a turtle like defendedness? Paradoxically, the first thing I would suggest is to really appreciate how great your defenses are. And I'll say this with people quite often. You can afford to open the aperture a little bit because you're very good at closing it up. Fine. Really appreciate how great your defenses are. Join with the defense initially. And I find that's really useful for people to realize, okay, I can, and then second, do little experiments where you open up to a new piece of information, You try a new behavior. You enter into a different kind of activity than you normally do. And then knowing that you can always hunker down, you can always go back. But if it goes well, you could push back the bars, as you put it earlier, of your cage, 1 millimeter, 1 inch, even 1 foot at a time. That's really good. Third, I find it's really helpful to pick an area where you can really afford to be flexible because the stakes are super low. So maybe it has to do with something going back to cooking. Instead of putting allspice in your super duper cookies, try nutmeg instead. Okay, you're being deliberately flexible. So you're deliberately pushing against something that's a habit. We're getting also at here too, picking up on that last word, what William James pointed to a long time ago about habit. We're talking about the sweet spot. On the one hand, habits are really efficient. And being attached to your views and in your familiar routines, it's cognitively and neurologically efficient. There's a place for it because it frees up processing power for all kinds of other things. On the other hand, as William James, the great psychologist, the godfather, really, of American psychology, said that a wise person would pick some habit, some routine, I'll expand this to rigidly held view, and deliberately push on it each day. Push on something each day.
I think that's great, really practical advice. And to turn this toward the self a little bit, I wonder about the aspects of self concept or how we think about ourselves that we're rigidly attached to,
Yeah.
that we have that rigidity around versus the ones that we have a little bit more space around. And so to return to what I was talking about when I was kind of setting up this attachment idea, I think it can be really helpful for people to go through a deliberate process of taking a look at what are those self concepts and how might they be bumping into the kind of change that I want to create in my life, right? So like how do you actually think about yourself? What's your self framework that you're dealing with? Do you think about yourself as um, a fundamentally good person? Do you think about yourself as somebody who's capable of learning what you need to learn in order that skill acquisition, like you were talking about, Dad, and your cooking framework for this whole thing? Can you go out and identify and get the ingredients that you need in order to change? All of these are different things that we can look at, and it can be really helpful to just go through a deliberate process. For some people, that might be like journaling around it, maybe asking like question stems of different kinds. I am a fill in the blank. I care about fill in the blank. I think that the world is fill in the blank. And sometimes just going through that kind of immediate reflective process where you do a sort of free association and you just fill in the first thing that comes to mind for you into these various blanks can be a really productive exercise. I've definitely gone through versions of that myself, and it's been quite helpful.
I do wonder, though, the extent to which holding on to an identity of, for example, saying, well, I'm depressed. I'm a
Mm,
depressed
mhm.
person, or the tendency of language to sort of essentialize things and reify them and thingify them. So to say, you know, I'm, um, you know, I'm bipolar, and you could hear that I'm grappling with this because there could be ways that pattern recognition is useful, where you realize, oh, okay, in the aggregate, like I would say about myself, I'm introverted. All right, I'm a friendly introvert. That's kind of how I would describe it, and okay, that's useful. On the other hand, does that perpetuate a person's stagnation in, if you will?
Or is it a useful kind of acceptance to go back to the first one, right? And
Yeah,
there's clearly some balance between those two things that you're pointing to and highlighting here that I think is really interesting. We're actually planning on doing an episode on how to break out of a depressive mood cycle.
yeah,
That's going to be a conversation that we have pretty soon. And man, I think that this question really relates to that topic, the way that we conceive of ourselves, including our mood, our temperament, things like that. Um, and it's tricky because both things are clearly true. It's
yeah,
clearly supportive to people to have a self identity that allows them to access resources, understand themselves better, go find the material out in the world that could be helpful for them. To give a specific example, it was extremely helpful for my partner Elizabeth when she got clarity around like complex PTSD.
Hmm.
or around ADHD for her, because it allowed her
Yeah,
to access all of these resources that
that's right.
she just didn't realize would help her in a variety of different ways. And then, hey, guess what? They helped her, which is a beautiful thing. And at the same time, man, I totally agree with you. To use maybe a lighter example of this, for a long time, I thought of myself as an anxious person.
Mm,
That was like my framework on myself, in part because I had a lot of people say various versions of that to me. And that was really helpful for me for a while. But what happened is I kept changing and I became less anxious, but I still had this identity as an anxious person that was kind of anchoring me a little bit. And so I needed to do some work to kind of release that identity a little in order to capture the gains of the actual change that I had experienced. So there's clearly this push pull there. I don't know if you have any thoughts on anything that I've said so far, or any nuance you'd like to add to this as a practicing clinician, but that's just sort of how I think about it.
yeah. Okay. So there's the ways in which we can become trapped in
Hmm.
a kind of a view of ourselves. There are ways in which it actually is liberating. Great, good. Then there's the question of does regarding oneself as, let's say, anxious, or I am ADHD, I am bipolar, something like that. Does that itself obstruct progress? A lot. It is my experience that the issue is actually deeper. So they're using their identification with some psychiatric label about themselves as a way to avoid the risks, or to avoid making the efforts, or to avoid engaging their own mind in skillful ways. So they use the identity for that purpose, but it's not so much that the identity directly gets in the way. It might be a nuance that's is sort of like it's a difference that doesn't make a difference. I don't know, but I find that useful.
That's one of those things that we could totally talk about for, again, at least a full episode. And
Yeah,
it's a very it's one of those conversations that makes me leery, because I think that it would be easy for that to come across as like invalidating somebody's identity or invalidating somebody's sense of self, or
yeah,
questioning whether or not they're actually a fill in the blank. And that's obviously not what we're trying to do here. We're pointing to really a pretty subtle and interesting thing, which is that the self concept that we have does in fact impact our behavior. And like, what do we take on as self concept? And
yeah,
one example of this, just in popular culture right now, is the kind of softening and loosening of the word autistic, and
yeah,
how there's been just a massive rise in the number of people on social media, particularly young people on platforms like TikTok, referring to themselves as being a little bit autistic or having
yeah.
autistic traits or things like that. And two things can be true at the same time. On the one hand, that might totally be true, and on the other hand, man, we are really loosening how that word is used, particularly from like a diagnostic standpoint. And I think that there are pluses and minuses to both, and that's kind of why it's tricky. On the one hand, we get increasing acceptance, increasing access to resources, and on the other hand, man, are we kind of cheapening these words in some way? Again,
That's
this is something
great.
we could just
Yeah,
talk about this forever. So
yeah.
I
Well, I'll just
I
throw
want
this
to
one
want to be
last little
careful about
thing.
it. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
this
Yeah.
this last detail in, partly also related to those three things I said that are useful whether you're making cookies in the outer world or making cookies in the inner world. The first of them being, clear seeing or knowing. One major factor of good knowing is not knowing. It's humility, curiosity, don't know, beginner's mind, child mind. And I think with regard to the category of identity, and we're still on attachment here, things that keep us stuck, it can be very useful to go, don't know, don't know who I am, right? Don't know about this viewpoint or behavior that I'm habitually attached to. Don't know, don't know. That's a nice solvent, like it dissolves things. Don't know.
Another major factor that tends to get in the way of change is essentially a lack of motivation. And this is where rock bottom comes in as a concept for a lot of people, because change is really hard. Systems resist change. Our homeostatic base, to use some terminology, is pretty calcified for a lot of people. And change usually involves a degree of discomfort. And in order to want to move into the discomfort of change, you need some motivation. And most of the time, for people to embrace the little pain of change, sometimes the big pain of change, you need a little bit of pain going on in your current environment. So for a lot of people, they get into this kind of pattern where they think that they should change something, but they don't really care about it that much. They don't have that much change motivation, actually, because their life is okay. Um, but the should really hangs out in the back of their mind. And that should causes them a lot of pain. They spend a lot of time. I've certainly spent a lot of time beating themselves up about not doing this thing that they're not actually that motivated to do, which just kind of doubles down on their suffering, right? They're both not getting the benefits of changing in the way, and they're beating themselves up for not changing. And that messy middle, I think, is a really rough place for people. It's certainly a place that I've spent a lot of time. I'm wondering how you think in general, Dad, about the concept of like rock bottom as a change motivator for people, and whether or not you think that that's kind of necessary to make large changes. Because there are some people who think that that's really the way that anything meaningful happens for people.
Motivation is really central. How much do you want it? How much does it matter to you? But then it becomes very tricky. What do we mean, you? How much do you want it? It implies that the you is unitary rather than highly compounded, distributed, and dynamic. What do you mean want, right? So it's complicated. So I'll just say a few things here. First, there is a truth that sometimes it happens that a person who's typically around drugs and alcohol, there are other things too, where they find themselves just hitting bottom. And at that point, there's a change of heart that's really far reaching, often accompanied by, healthy remorse, guilt, regret, or shame. And they just don't ever do that thing again, or they turn that corner. That really was their last drink. On the other hand, those dramatic stories leave out the fact that many, many people, including often that same person, so-called hit bottom, and then they just sort of bounced off the bottom and went back to their old ways 3 days later after all their resolutions to change. So it's not necessarily true that hitting bottom is will produce change. And also, I think there are a lot of people who change sometimes qualitatively without hitting bottom. They just get it and they quietly go in a different direction. It also happens that people gradually accumulate, gradual change over time. And I want to speak to you some ways to motivate oneself. So I think that it is inescapable that we have existential responsibility for our own lives. There's no way around it. And it's out of respect for people, not out of shaming them for not wanting it enough or trying hard enough to date. It's out of respecting people that they are they are the makers and the agents of their own life, profoundly so. And there's a place for clearing space inside your mind, sometimes related to clearing space outside yourself. So, for example, you might go for a long walk or sit by the edge of the ocean or do a week-long meditation retreat. Um, Clearing space to really look hard at something that matters to you behaviorally. Maybe you really do need to take a big breath and go back into the dating world again. As a late middle-aged person who still wants to find a relationship, even though the dating world scares the heck out of you. Or maybe you realize that at a personal level, you really do need to make a shift psychologically in how you interact with key people. Maybe you realize, I'm going to tattoo NMP on the inside of my eyelids, figuratively, not literally, not my problem. Maybe you make that change. There's a place for that. Second, if 1% of you knows that it would be really good for you to do something that 99% of you opposes, one way to work with that is to bypass the particular issue and work on your overall state of being so that the next time you take a look at the change you're trying to motivate in yourself, the one who is looking at that is
A
better
fundamentally
rested,
different
well
person. Yeah.
fed, calmer. It's so much easier to do things that you resist a little bit when you're in a good mood than to do them when you're tired and hungry and in a bad mood and feel really let down by other people. And third, set yourself up to succeed. Set yourself up to win. If you're trying to change what you eat, get the carbs out of the cupboard. Get the beer out of the fridge. I've done both of those things, frankly. If you're trying to promote exercise, talk to your really quite buff son about, how your forearms are getting a little bigger and not as big as his, but and enjoy his encouragement. Gee, who could I be talking about right now? If you want to
I
get,
think you got great forearms, Dad. You got nothing to worry about.
I
For like
got,
a
I got
71-year-old dude, you're killing it.
it's a work in progress. Anyway, exercise. Go with somebody out there in the world. Maybe you want to be more grateful. Do this. What I know people do. They'll text their buddy, their gratitude buddy, every day with one thing they're grateful for before they go to
Mm.
sleep. They're just committed to that. Some point during the day, they'll text their buddy with one thing, and they'll each do that with each other. Set yourself up to succeed. It's a lot easier to stay motivated when you're on the downhill with the wind at your back than when you're scratching and clawing uphill, with no support.
And that's great, Dad. And I did want to talk about a particular aspect of lack of change motivation, but we already kind of talked about it a little bit when we were in the identity section, and this is called secondary gains. So would you mind kind of
Ooh.
explaining to people what secondary gains are?
Yeah. None of my clients ever wanted to think about this part. For a good reason.
Shockingly, I don't want to think about it either.
Ooh, me either. It's kind of, I don't mind using this word, payoff. What's the
Yeah.
payoff in what you're doing? So I'll give you an example that, as Freud said first, sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. There really is no secondary gain. And I want to also say that sometimes certain habits take on a life of their own long after there's any gain. Interestingly, I was talking with your mom earlier this morning about, you know, people we know. And I'll just kind of disguise things here. But here's the bottom line: this is a person who's dealing with a serious health issue. And one of the consequences of that health issue is that it prevents this person from stepping back into the job market, which is scary for the person. Okay. And they have various reasons for not dealing with their health issue that on the face are ridiculous. So there's some reason why this person is not dealing with their health issue. Well, hypothetically, it's worth inquiring, is there the payoff, the secondary gain of enabling the avoidance of experiences of anxiety that would occur if this person actually were able to step more into the job market and no longer had a good reason not to, all right, because of the health issues? That would be an example. Other examples are people holding on to grievances, wearing their reproaches like a badge of honor. You done me dirt, especially in relationships. They kind of hold on to the grievance because they want to be able to, twist the knife in the person who did them dirt or to maintain a claim on other people. Sometimes people who are dependent upon others are afraid that if they become more self-reliant and more capable, that others will abandon them. So there's the secondary gain there. I think that's a good list just for now. But these are examples of things. And I find with people, there's kind of a useful structure that's great. So you're the person and you say, okay, here's this thing that you say you want to change, but you're having a hard time changing. So let's sort of slow it down here. Number one, what is the thing? Whatever it might be. Your behavior, what you eat, what you drink, how you are, what you avoid, fine. Second, what are the gains? What's it do for you? What are the benefits? Including the kind of secondary gain list. All right. Okay. Those are the benefits. Those are the payoffs. Just being honest about it. Self acceptance, right? We start there, as you said, Forrest. And then third, what are the costs? It's very straightforward. You have the benefits, you have the costs, you kind of unpack it, you stare at it, and then you basically ask the person, okay, moment of truth time. What is it you actually value in your life? What do you really care about? And even what's the larger framework of values in which you can contemplate these costs and benefits, short term, long term, different categories. All right, net, bottom line, what's best for you and what's most consistent with your values here?
Yeah, this is another one of those things that can be a little tricky to talk about because talking about secondary gains or referring to them can make it seem like you're minimizing somebody's suffering or
Yeah,
you're questioning whether or not they're actually in as much pain as they say that they're in, even just by suggesting the possibility that there could be some other kind of payoff for
yeah,
whatever's going on.
that's right.
And again, of course, we don't want to do that. At the same time, if what we're doing is looking at ourselves in this process, right? Like that's the framework of what we're talking about here. And we're asking ourselves the question, why are we struggling to change right now? It can be really helpful to maybe take a look at what is it that you get from this behavior that you're complaining about, or this behavior that you feel like is holding you back. An example of this that I've shared on the show in the past for myself is that for a long time, I really complained about being, complained mostly internally. To be clear, I had like a lot of internalized resentments that I built up over time about being the person in the group who did all of the planning, all of the social planning. I was getting all the people together. I was doing the legwork. I was figuring out where we were going. I was organizing the situation, all of that good stuff. And I was getting kind of frumpy about the fact that I was doing what I experienced as a disproportionate amount of the effort. And I really went through a process with this one day where I was like, Forrest, what's the deal with this? Like, you can just stop doing this. You don't have to do this behavior that you're complaining about. You're making it other people's fault that you're doing all of this work when in truth, you have total control over whether or not you do this work. So what's the payoff here? Well,
Yeah,
there are a bunch of payoffs. For starters, I see the people I want to see more often. Then we do the things that we want to do. And hey, referring to that anxiety earlier, I get to control the situation. We're going where I want to go, when I want to go there, in the kind of circumstance that I want to have around me. That's a lot of control. And that control helps me avail my own anxiety. So there were all of these secondary gains from this behavior that I was complaining about. So that's a very simple kind of low level version of a kind of issue a person might have here, but I just wanted to put it into very everyday terms.
I think that's great. And sometimes what a person might say in response to another person who says, well, but you're getting so much out of that way of being. They might essentially say, what, you think I'm doing this on purpose?
Yeah.
Which becomes extremely interesting. And the short answer is, yeah, you are doing it on purpose. Now, what do we mean you? The
Which
you,
gets to some of the subconscious stuff that we were talking about during the defenses episode, maybe.
yeah, the you is 20 voices on the committee, pulling in different directions, grabbing the mic, playing footsie under the table, and building coalitions with each other and all the rest of that. And so, yeah, in that broad sense, who else is doing it besides you? You as the committee, right? That claiming of choice becomes really important. That's another aspect of it here. Let's say someone is doing something maladaptive. Let's say in your example, Forrest, an intermediate step would be something like, okay, I'm Forrest, and I'm deliberately taking on more than my share of work. I'm stepping into responsibilities. I'm choosing to do this. I am the one who is doing it, even at some personal cost. Yeah, own it. And then on the basis of owning it, then you can start to let it go. You can move into disowning it. You have to start by owning it before you can really authentically move into disowning something.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and great advice here. And maybe to stretch our concept of secondary gains to the absolute breaking point here, a kind of secondary gain kind of gets to the fifth thing that I wanted to talk about, which is
Yeah.
fear of the unknown.
Okay.
Maybe one version of a secondary gain is that perpetuating our behavior, perpetuating how we are, allows us to avoid uncertainty, allows us to avoid facing the things that we don't know. And I think that there is this kind of fundamental, I'd rather the enemy I know than the person that I don't, even if the enemy is inside the building. You know, even
Right.
if the enemy is this
Yeah,
problematic
that's
version
right.
of who we are, we just have an orientation right there because we have a fundamental survival operation going on in the background of our mind all the time. And the unknown is spooky.
Again, brilliant. Because for one, you're naming that which is routinely left out.
Yeah. Mm.
Kind of by this very nature, we don't notice people's fear of the unknown because it's unknown, right? And one thing that really helps is a fundamental kind of is curiosity. So curiosity, you keep turning over stones, you keep looking down different places, you try to take a higher point so you can get a broader view. You're curious. Related to that is not knowing, don't know what the unknown might hold, don't know. Another element, I think about attachment theory, is the balance of exploration and return to secure base. So you see that in children. The
Mm.
more that they have a secure base, the more they will go out and explore. And so to help people with the fear of the unknown, it really helps to, as Baron von Clausewitz said in his Rules of Warfare, this Prussian general, secure a base of operations. Or as Alex Honnold, soloing up this cliff in Morocco, is moving from one stable hold to another, right? So when you secure your base, then you're much more willing to kind of cast loose of the familiar moorings. You're laughing. What
Well,
else?
but I mean, I'm just enjoying the scope of our operation here today, Dad. Between cooking, rock climbing, and Prussian generals, we're really checking a lot of our boxes here, and I love that for you.
A mind is a terrible thing to waste, right?
Hey, I think you're right on here, man. And I also appreciate that. I don't know if I have too much to add to what you've already said, and I'm we have done episodes on the past on courage and
Yeah.
including emotional courage, and I just think that there is this fundamental courage aspect to it. But courage is based on evidence, right? Like as we develop a
Hmm.
sense of our own capability, self-efficacy, the easier it becomes for us to face uncertain situations because we have greater and greater degrees of self-trust in our ability to deal with different kinds of circumstances. But that gets a little tricky for people sometimes. I've even seen that in my own life because I would describe myself as somebody who's like pretty high up in terms of self-efficacy. I've got a lot of view of the self as being able to learn, solve problems, all of that good stuff, but it's domain specific. And I think that
Mm.
people sometimes lose that, where they have a concept of themselves as having like a lot of self efficacy, but it's in certain arenas. Maybe it's not emotional self efficacy.
Right.
Maybe it's not vulnerability self efficacy.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not like sharing with my partner some aspect of me that I'm concerned about self efficacy. So we can get a little like, again, a little trapped in a view of the self. Oh, I have plenty of self-efficacy. This isn't a problem for me at all. Of course, I'm not worried about it. When really in these other domains, there are a lot of fears that are operating in the background.
With regard to fear of the unknown, I think there's something useful that can happen in people where they just tell the truth that they're getting bored with what's so familiar. They're getting kind of tired of the daily routine. And it's genuine. It's not some kind of characterological restlessness that can never settle. It's that they're in a rut. It's okay. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, TGIF, have fun on the weekend, rinse and repeat. Monday, do it all over again. And to listen to that voice that says that we need to shake it up here. Not there's a place for novelty. We want to try new things. We don't want to stagnate. I think Eric Erickson described the developmental challenge in middle age, especially late middle age, as the challenge of stagnation versus generativity. And I know a lot of people in middle age who, frankly, would be really served by taking a big breath and looking at generativity in their own life. Doesn't mean you have to figure out quantum mechanics and get a Nobel Prize, something, something. It just means change your cookie recipe, try a new route to work, take a look at some aspect of your creative life that would be fun for you. Take a watercolor class online, do something, generativity. So I think that that's a really good way to step into the unknown because to be generative, by definition, you're moving into what's unknown. you're listening to that part of you that's just sort of getting tired of the familiar and really is interested in what's on the other side of that hill that's bounded your life.
I really like how you're highlighting the boredom aspect of this, Dad. I think that's a really clever way into this because it's not the same as like attacking fear directly, but
Yeah,
it's more about increasing in some ways your felt sense of the discomfort of staying the way you are,
yeah,
which is one way to increase change motivation. So it's using upping change motivation as a way to deal with this fear of the unknown. And I think that's kind of like a clever way to slice through that particular knot that can emerge for people. So I like that as a solution. So as we get toward the end here, I am going to return to some of those circumstantial factors that we talked about at the beginning, including particularly our environmental ones, and highlight how our environment can affect us in a way that maybe we can do something about. And so I'm going to call the sixth one crabs in a bucket. There's a classic visual, a bunch of crabs in a bucket. As any one crab tries to climb out of the bucket, the other crabs are also trying to climb out of the bucket, and they end up inevitably pulling that crab back down into the bucket, right? So none of the crabs end up escaping. And this really highlights the impact of unsupportive environments on us. And I think that one of the most important levers for change, and one of the most unexplored ones for many people, is changing their environments, and particularly changing their environments in a way that focuses on changing the people who are around them, who are limiting their capacity to change. This could be a whole bunch of different things: chaotic and unsupportive family systems, different kinds of abusive relationships, even just like friend groups that have tendencies that you've outgrown over time. Friends are often a tricky one because we opt into those relationships at one point in life and then we all keep on changing. And sometimes we change in ways that just like pull us further away from our friends. Um, think about how your sense of what a supportive friendship looks like today and how that might be different from how you thought about a supportive friendship 10 years ago. And that can really highlight some of the issues around this for people. And I also want to say that, sometimes it's a really noble choice for people to actually stay in the bucket. Maybe they're trying to be the sane person in a chaotic system. Maybe they're trying to help a friend also exit the bucket with them, exit this unsupportive environment. But those environments are really a huge factor for us.
my first response here is one that I think is important for people to have, whether they're the one who is speaking about the situation or the one who is hearing their friend speak about the situation. And the response in myself right now is one of feeling the weight of what you're talking about, the poignance, the impact, the weight. And you and I focus mainly, appropriately, on things people can do, efforts they can make, why it's important to motivate yourself to make the efforts that you can, so forth, so forth. That side of the truth. The other side of the truth is that many people are doing what you and I are, I think, I hope, helpfully recommending, but they're doing it while walking uphill into a headwind, while hauling their loved ones along the way. It's tough. So to me, you're really, it's quite tender for us, what you're saying here about honoring what's hard. I think it's also really helpful, especially in the context of self-help, self-improvement, positive psychology, my turf certainly. Still, it's really important to have the humility to realize how affected we are by our circumstances and to avoid the grandiosity of thinking, oh, I should be able to have the power to just step away from or change everything. No, we are entangled in all kinds of situations. We're designed to be affected and inhibited and influenced by all these social factors around us, going deep into our evolution as social primates. Of course, we're affected by all that, and it's important to recognize how hard it is to change in the face of a lot of environmental resistance, including friends, families, relatives, culture, social systems. And second, how important it is to do what we can to change those external factors, which then can help things change on the inside. And one of the strategies that really worked for me and has continually worked for me along the way is I'll realize something about myself. Like, for example, 1% of me realizes that I really need to be more emotionally and spontaneously expressive, going back to my college days. And 99% of me was completely incapable of doing that in my current settings. So the 1% of me would sign me up for an encounter group. We put ourselves in situations that are better for us. We start looking for people who are better for us. We realize that we need to reduce contact with things that are bad for us. We need to disengage from certain activities, like playing shooter games 6 hours a day, that's just training our brain into a kind of a paranoid, aggressive, twitchy kind of way of being that we need to self medicate with, you know, 3 shots before we go to bed. Um, so I want to really honor the importance of this point that you're bringing up and just say, yeah, it's really important to honor how much it affects us and to take action to the extent we can in the outer world, not just the inner one.
So we've moved through my 6 factors that I think particularly can stop somebody from changing the ways that they want to. But I really want to toss this to you here, Dad, as you've been thinking about this. So let's say that you're working with somebody who's facing a real issue, but they've just plateaued around it for a while. They haven't had the breakthrough that they've been looking for. I'm wondering if you're working with that person, what would come to mind for you as something you could do with them to create that change or create the kind of growth that they're looking for? Or just broadly, as we get to the end, if there's anything that you want to highlight as core issues that tend to get in the way of that change.
For people in general, not just people specifically in therapy, it's really helpful to think about, okay, what have I tried already to with regard to my thing? Let's say a person is quite anxious, or in my case, let's say felt sad and lonely underneath it all. What have you tried already and how's that worked? What has been effective for you and what has not been effective for you? And if it hasn't been effective for you, how come? What is the issue? What have you been aiming for? What have you tried? What has been successful and why? What has been unsuccessful and why? What are the lessons from here? That's a really, really helpful thing. When someone comes in to my office the first time, after establishing relationship and kind of getting a sense of the issues, I'm really interested in what have you done already? Like, have you done therapy on this already? Have you read some books? Have you tried this or that? How's that gone? And right there often are many, many clues. Like, oh, the reason it didn't work is that you didn't stick with it past the first day. Oh, maybe that's why it didn't work. Right? Or, oh, you don't have a kind of a mind that that sort of suggestion is very helpful for. For example, you have great cognition already. That's part of the problem. You're kind of in your cognitions and they don't really have any traction. We need to work at a more somatic, emotional, visceral, nonverbal depth level. Okay, great. So we're learning things. But then let's suppose there's the real case where a person is really suffering something and really wanting your help with that. And you can see that they are actively preventing the help from landing.
Mm.
That's the tough case, right? That you're kind of getting at here. That's really delicate to explore because, as I can say, as someone who's fallen into these pits, one of the pitfalls is that when you bring this up as a therapist, it's really easy for the client to feel shamed as if they're not being a good client. They're insincere, they're not really trying, they've got some hidden agenda, you don't really like them, etc. It's very delicate. It's really delicate. It's very understandably delicate. Understandably delicate. So, with regard to that, I find what's helpful, as therapists generally do, to make sure that this is really what's happening and then bounce up to the bird's eye view again, where we're just kind of looking at the situation with the client, not in an adversarial way where we're banging on each other, but rather we're both looking at it together. Oh, isn't it interesting that, you know, don't know mind, curiosity. Isn't it interesting that we've been doing these things and you say this and that, and yet really when it, on any given day, you just don't want to. What do you see about this? Right. Literally just sort of no praise, no blame. We're just unpacking it. Not good, not bad. We're just unpacking it. That can often be helpful for a person. And I've had people on the one hand, um, when we do that, say maybe a little ruefully, wow, this is right. I have to take this seriously. And then they really buckle down. And over the next 10 weeks, major changes happen. Or alternately, they look at it all and they go, I honestly, I just don't care, or I'm just not ready. I'm just not ready. Okay. And then we're honest about that. So that's really helpful. The last thing I'll just say about it, in terms of moving forward, what I said earlier really is important, that one of the most useful things to do when a person is stuck, that's where we started. Like you said, attachment is the literal definition of stuck. You're attached to something. When a person is stuck and level one efforts, so there are two ways here. Level one efforts have not succeeded. We've tried. They've done stuff. I've used all the standard methods. We've been in rapport about it. Hasn't worked. Then you look to level two in two different kinds of ways. One option for level two is you realize I need to bring strengths and resources to bear of a different category. We need to look into medication, or this is really a couples issue. I need to bring the family to bear, or this person has an addiction problem. They're not dealing with it on their own. We need to bring in other stakeholders. This is more of a family system kind of problem here. So you go more to level two, or this person really would benefit from um, a certain kind of experience. I refer them to the Hoffman process for a deep dive into their childhood, for example, or to another therapist who's going to do some pillow pounding with them and emotional release work. Okay, fine. A different kind of level two is to take a look and stop banging on the focal issue. The first kind of level two stays focused on the focal issue. Okay. The different kind of level two stops resisting the focal issue and in effect bypasses it to look to what else could we grow in the mind of this person as a kind of strength or mood. Positive mood is the therapist's best ally in a lot of ways, because then there's the room to become motivated. You don't have that smothering blanket burying you every day after you walk out on the way out of your therapist's office, the return of the smothering blanket, yuck, of depressed mood. So what can we do over here? Maybe we need to cultivate more mindfulness over here. Maybe we need to cultivate more self-compassion over here. Maybe we need to develop more vitality. Now, this person doesn't need a therapist. They need a trainer. This person doesn't need anxiety training. They need a yoga class, whatever. Right. And then maybe after that other resource has been developed, we're going to come back to the focal issue.
Again, much like how you highlighted boredom as a way to kind of get around an issue with fear,
Yeah.
you're highlighting developing these secondary skills that can absolutely support somebody in all of these useful ways for dealing with these different kinds of issues. And I think that you're right. Often when we've plateaued, definitionally, we've gotten kind of stuck in a way of doing or looking.
Yeah.
We're trapped here. So what helps us break out? And most of the time it's new inputs. It's new ideas. It's a new way of looking at the world. And sometimes you can get those new inputs in the same old spaces, but it's often a lot easier to change the space, to change the frame. Maybe that's the frame of the counseling work you're doing with somebody else. Maybe that's the frame of the people you're surrounding yourselves with. Maybe it's the frame of the activities that you're engaging in your life or the kinds of mental processes that you're engaging. But whatever you're changing, that change is going to help you with whatever the central plateau is as well. It's going to have this secondary positive effect. And I love that you're highlighting that here at the end.
Yeah, that's great. And then if I could, Forrest, this has been super useful for me personally too.
Oh, great.
I want to end on now you're the musician really here. What's a coda, right? It's sort of the
Yeah.
last little bit of, okay,
Mm-hmm.
good. I got it right. Yay. Okay, Coda, at the very end here. Looking back on all this stuff, three things really stand out as major factors for positive development. And if positive development is not happening, diagnostically, to look at each one of these three and to see if there's something to do with regard to each one. Okay. So, first is tell the truth. I find that if people are stuck, often we need to tell the truth at a deeper level. Tell the truth. Deep down inside, tell the truth to yourself, tell the truth to trusted others. Know that the truth is evolving, you're discovering it. Get down to the deeper layers. Tell the truth in nonverbal ways. No, it's like a knowing and opening to what is actually you. What's it like to be you? What's it like to be you in the deepest, most sensitive, tenderest, most intimate ways? Opening into that. Really, really crucial. Second thing, surrender to the best within you. Whatever that is, already within you are certain good qualities. Even if you're pretty fractured and pretty traumatized and carrying a lot of burdens, in you are numerous beautiful good things. Be lived by them. Give over to them. Let them be the well springs, the currents that carry you along. Rather than trying to make something new happen or scratch and claw your way up the mountain, give over to the lovingness, the quirkiness, the funniness, the curiosity, the sweetness, the kindness, the goofiness, the intensity, the fieriness inside you. That's a beautiful, positive quality. Surrender to the best within you. I think of will sometimes as a matter of surrendering to the best within you, making the choice to be lived by it. And then the third thing, keep going. Perseverance furthers, as it says in the I Ching. You can honor that you've made efforts today. You can rest when you go to bed. You made efforts. It was a good one today. And then tomorrow, keep going. So those three. Know yourself as deeply as you can. Surrender to the best within you and keep going.
I had a great time talking with Rick today about all of the things that get in the way of us changing, because we've all had that experience. There's something we want to change, there's something that we want to grow or develop in our lives, there's some habit we have that we just can't seem to kick. And we get trapped in a plateau related to it. Maybe we've made some progress, but we just haven't gone as far as we want to go. There are some things in our lives that are just not that changeable. Our personal history is not that changeable. Our genetics are then not that changeable. But sometimes accepting the things that aren't so changeable can help us address the things that are. And that was the first factor that we looked at, acceptance. Acceptance is the practice of seeing reality clearly. And it was also a big part of what I would call Rick's cooking model for change here, where he highlighted three key factors. First, telling the truth. Second, getting the ingredients that you need, growing key strengths in your life, maybe. And then third, applying effort over time, because you're not going to make what you want to make without, hey, getting in the kitchen and actually trying to make it. Then the second factor that we talked about was attachment. And Rick particularly focused on rigidity as a core issue for people. How flexible are we in how we appraise ourselves or appraise the world around us? And what can we do to deliberately cultivate more psychological flexibility over time? And we got here into a whole, and I thought pretty interesting conversation about the ways in which attachment to self concept can limit our ability to change. There are a lot of pluses and minuses to this whole thing. It was a very nuanced conversation because two things can be true at the same time. On the one hand, it can be very helpful for us to have a particular self identity that might lead to us understanding ourselves better or being able to access different kinds of resources. And at the same time, sometimes that self identity can become very calcified and lead to a set of behaviors that are actually not helping us anymore because we've outgrown them. And one aspect of this part of the conversation that I think is safe for most people to lean into is how Rick highlighted Don't Know Mind as a key resource for many people. Where can we find more opportunities to be a little uncertain, to be a little curious about what's going on inside of us or what's happening inside of other people. Then the third factor we talked about was a lack of change motivation. And alongside that, the question, what increases our motivations? Rick really highlighted taking on your role as the creator of your own destiny, making the commitment to change in your life. A story that he's told in the past is this instance that he had earlier on in life of feeling like he hadn't really fully stepped into his life. He hadn't made the deliberate choice to be here, to do what he could to improve his life in the ways that he could, and to really give a good solid effort throughout that experience. And then, second, he talked about listening to the 1% part of personality that really knew that he should make some kind of a change. Sometimes we're in situations where 1% of us wants something and 99% of us wants a different thing, but we really know that the 1% is in the right there. And what can help people sometimes is working on their overall state of being. So when they return to that question in the future, it's a materially different person who's making that choice of which voice to listen to. Then fourth, we talked about a key aspect of lack of motivation: secondary gains. Secondary gains are the benefits that we get from thoughts or feelings or behaviors that we think of as being painful or problematic or not serving us. I gave one example here of doing a lot of extra planning for my social group where I didn't recognize all of the benefits that I got from this activity that I was complaining about. And one major form of secondary gains is what we talked about a little earlier in the episode, the various ways in which what we do reinforces our self identity. The problematic behaviors that we have place us into a certain category or into a certain role in a group of people from which we derive that identity. And once we have that identity, we really don't want to change it most of the time. Fifth, we talked about fears of the unknown. Fear can really operate quietly in the background, and it exerts this hidden influence over our behavior. And Rick highlighted focusing deliberately on boredom. Boredom can actually be a great antidote to fears of the unknown because it highlights the suffering that's present in staying the way that we are. Whereas fear tries to highlight the suffering that could be present in changing in some way. So you're kind of counteracting that by giving yourself a little bit more change motivation. And then finally, the last factor that we talked about, crabs in a bucket. It is very normal for our environments to exert a great deal of influence on how we behave, who we are, and whether we're able to change. And a major aspect of our environments are the people that we surround ourselves with. Now, there are a lot of reasons to stay in a bucket. If you're making the active choice to do that, maybe you want to help the people who are in the bucket. Maybe you're trying to get another crab out of that bucket. Whatever it is that you're trying to do, okay? Lots of good reasons for that. But if we're really trying to change in a meaningful way, and we are constantly surrounding ourselves with people who are incentivized to have us not change, maybe it's a social group that has some kind of communal activity that we no longer want to do, or that we don't think really serves who we are actually. Maybe it's a way of relating to each other in that social group that we just don't think is good for us anymore. Well, that group's going to put a lot of pressure on you to stay the way that you are. And if you're already dealing with a change plateau, that pressure is going to be very difficult for you to overcome. Then at the end of the episode, Rick offered a number of thoughts on breaking through a plateau. First, you can ask yourself, what have you tried already? How has it gone? And hey, if it hasn't been so effective, well, why not? Second, he highlighted the role of shame in keeping people stuck, because once we highlight the true material, the core material that's on the table, the big issue that lies underneath whatever it is that we're processing, a lot of shame tends to come up for people because we have flown a little too close to the sun. We've gotten clear, we've gotten real about what's going on inside of us, which often includes a lot of stuff that we aren't so proud of. And then third, he talked about how we can bypass the primary issue, the big thing that we're trying to change, and highlight the other stuff that we could potentially grow in our lives. This removes our hyper focus on whatever it is that's wearing us down. For example, maybe we just need more mindfulness or self-compassion or vitality or whatever else in order to actually break through this plateau. The example that he gave is that maybe they don't need another therapist, maybe they just need a yoga class. Because after doing the yoga class for a given period of time, they've worked on their vitality, they've got more energy, and now they just feel like they're in a different place to tackle the problems that they're facing. And a lot of the time, upping those resources, upping that overall state of being can really help us deal with whatever it is that we're facing. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I had a great time recording this with Rick. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while and you haven't subscribed to it yet, please subscribe down below. We would really appreciate that. If you're listening on Spotify or in iTunes, if you could leave a rating and a positive review, that would really help us out. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.